This is The Alchemist's Tomb, Part 8, The Danube. Chapter 49, Vienna, Austria, 1854. William Drummond Stewart woke early, slipping out of bed so as not to wake Christina. The sun had not yet come up, but enough light arrived to help him quietly dress without disturbing her sleep. After spending time in mansions, yachts, and palaces during his life, waking in a small cottage made it feel like the most secure fortress in all the world. He paused at Carl and Emma's room, but then kept walking. He tiptoed down the hallway and stairs and walked to the front door. At the coat rack, he secured his pistol before slipping on his jacket and grabbing his bowler hat. The cottage was one of a dozen small houses that lined the street of Upper Vienna that grew on the edge of Schweitzer Garden, a large urban botanical garden on the edge of the city. Stewart flipped up the collar on his jacket, wanting to be as invisible as possible. His fingers brushed over the bristle of his shaved head before setting it atop his head. The hair of his beard had sprouted to over an inch, effectively transforming him into the image of his father. Not a bad place to hide from the world, Stewart thought as he passed from the row of cheap cottages and into the gardens. A college friend of Carl Geyer had taken stewardship of the park and was paid a modest wage to tend to the botanical needs of the park. Has this quest robbed Carl of his golden years? He could remain in such a place. Risking the odds of a miraculous encounter with someone who knew him, they'd chosen Vienna, Austria, as the safe house for Emma and Christina. From all they learned from their hostage, Lachlan Morrison, both Eos and Vendita would likely target the women to get to the men if they dared return to Mirthly Castle. The Swiss garden was as secure and random as either man could come up with. Stewart walked along the outside of the park, hoping to calm his frayed nerves and anxiety. He had spent the previous day writing his last will and testament, knowing he was about to depart the following day down the Danube River and into the lion's den. As he walked, he could not help but think of his son. 2 decades earlier, George had been born to a servant girl, Christina. Imagine how my life would have been different if I had listened to my father. Thomas, his slain brother, would have become a cardinal by now. Nicolette would have arrived at St. Louis, run out of funding, and most likely would have been teaching at a St. Louis university still. Antoine Clement would have returned from his visit to St. Louis to go back to his young wife and daughter out in the Black Hills. With Clement's French ancestry, he would have served as a guide and buffalo hunter. And me? If he'd listened to his father, he would have found himself the fat, arrogant baron of Mirthly Castle after marrying some noblewoman. Christina and George would have stayed servants. Instead, William Drummond Stewart fled Scotland for adventures on the American frontiers. George had been born a bastard, and even though Stewart later married Christina and legitimized his bastard son as heir, the boy had never truly been a son to him. George idolized him, but in a way a child idolized Achilles or Odysseus. Having heard tales of the Napoleonic War, George grew up wanting to be a soldier. By the time Stewart returned home from his odyssey, his son left home to begin a career in the military. Will my estate please him or curse him? Stewart paused, noticing a solitary figure in the center of the park, sitting on the grass looking up at the heavens. Obviously, I'm not the only one who has things on his mind. He kept walking. From the various newspapers he'd read between the port of Venice and the train ride to Vienna, he learned that his son's military unit, the 93rd Highlanders, were being sent to the region to deal with the growing threat of Russian aggression. Do I really believe in coincidence anymore? Christina demanded that he write to their son prior to his departure, but Stewart didn't want anything to be traced back to their temporary home in Vienna. Stewart's hand went to his pistol inside of his jacket as a tingling sensation went down his spine. I'm being watched. The man at the center of the park was watching him, and then he saw the man reach for something. Stewart glanced for cover just in case. The man raised a hand and waved. Instead of reciprocating, Stewart looked to see if assassins were coming out of the woodwork. "It's me, you fool," a familiar voice cried out. "Carl? What is he doing?" "Come, join me on the lawn," Geyer insisted, patting the grass. Stewart crossed the lawn, standing over his friend. "Care to explain yourself?" "I couldn't sleep." "I know what you mean. Between the yacht and train, I couldn't help but feel my mind still spinning with motion." "No, it's not that. I was looking at this garden. I could have had a similar life back in Germany if I'd stayed. Instead, I had the adventure of a lifetime. Twice. I don't know if I could go back to such a sedentary life. I have decided to accompany you down the Danube." "But your child. The whole reason for coming here was so that you could take care of Emma." "We still have a few months, and even after that, the child will only be an infant who will only want its mother. If it's a boy, I'm going to name him Nicholas after. I can't take that away from you. I've wasted my life away from my son. I can't let you do the same. You'll grow to regret it." What I regret is that Nicolette died alone in that hotel in Baltimore. If I'd been with him, things might have been much different. I can't do the same with you. I know you plan to hire men to accompany you, but I can't let you face this danger alone. I have written up my own will and testament. I have a spot for you to sign, if you'd be so kind." Stewart took the paper and had to hold it against the pale light of the sky to read the dark letters. "Foster, you want me to adopt your son if you die. Now you're definitely staying here. Emma comes from wealth, but God forbid if I should die in the days to come, I would not want him raised by her family. Let both of them come to Mirthley Estate. Let little Nicholas become your ward." Has the old Carl finally returned? "This is a pointless conversation. I'm getting on that boat later this morning and shaking your hand and leaving you with the women here in Vienna. Sign, please," Carl Andreas Geyer insisted. It was good to have his old friend back, and Stewart signed. Chapter 50. Varna, Bulgaria, 1854. Jamie Anderson watched the naval battle from atop the roof of the yacht. Below him, the passengers and crew of the Mina pressed against the railing. A battle of the gods. Since leaving Mirthley Castle, Anderson had read all the stories about gods battling upon Earth only to leave a path of destruction behind. Now he saw Thor's lightning bolts and the groan of the Midgard serpent upon the waters of the Black Sea. The captain had doused the ship lights as he approached the battle, allowing them to watch from a safe distance of 5 miles. With Father McPherson, Frank Penny, Lachlan Morrison, and several of the Mina crew crowded along the observation deck, Anderson grew frustrated at his stature and improvised. With the aid of his own looking-glass, Anderson climbed to the highest platform, the yacht's roof, so he could see if the gods would smile on their venture. The port of Varna was the largest port along the western shore of the Black Sea. After parting ways with Lord Stewart in Cyprus, Anderson took charge of the remaining expedition and the yacht, which traveled north through the Aegean Sea and through the Bosphorus. At Istanbul, they were detained by the Ottoman Empire, which thoroughly terrified Anderson. The port authorities, however, were not looking for suspects from 2 unsolved murder sprees within its empire. No, they were preparing for war with Russia. It looks like the war has begun earlier than planned. In the flash of the cannons, Anderson could spot the flags flying from the 2 naval formations. The distinctive red flag with the white crescent and star made sense. Bulgaria had been part of the Ottoman Empire for the past few centuries. The white, blue, and red flag of Russia, however, should not have been present. When they'd left Mirthley Castle, Russia's border had been north of Moldavia, but now it possessed Moldavia, Transylvania, Wallachia, and Bulgaria, threatening the feasibility of their plans. Had it not been for a clash of gods, they would have made port at Varna and then traveled another 200 miles to the delta of the Danube River. They'll soon look to me for answers for our next step. The Russian fleet was losing badly. Ships exploded, ships burned, ships sunk. Suddenly, daylight arrived in the orchestrated slide of lantern shutters. We got too close. Atop the cabin, he remained in the shadows as the floodlights came from behind the ship. A siren followed the flood of lights. Shouts from the ship that had snuck up on them from behind, with one phrase quite clear to Anderson: "Prepare to be boarded." An order in English. What does that mean? To his left and his right, he saw other wolves prowling in the darkness. They were smaller, fast-moving ships that sailed in advance of a larger armada. A second navy had arrived at the port of Varna. England has joined the Ottoman Empire in its war against Russia. Anderson peeked around the deck of the roof, careful so as not to fall 10 feet to the deck below. A small boarding vessel with a dozen or so soldiers approached the side of the Mina, with the larger cruiser ready to blast them out of the water. I wonder what Lachlan Morrison is thinking of this. Penny stayed at the side of the prisoner, who, despite his professions of common cause, certainly could have caused trouble. For that reason, Anderson did not leave his spot. Traveling with a dwarf certainly would have identified the yacht for concerned parties. The boarding party, however, only had Russians on their mind. They stomped around the yacht, asked questions, and ended up in the command room speaking to the captain, who explained they were planning on traveling up the Danube River. "That is not happening," the British officer explained. Anderson realized the plan to reunite with Stewart had fallen apart. Apparently, a squabble in Jerusalem led to the cries of Christian persecution from the Ottoman Empire, leading Russia to come to the aid of Christians in Crimea and the Danubian principalities. Russian armies, led by Mikhail Gorokharov and Ivan Pashkevek, seized the area while the Russian fleet caught the Ottoman fleet at port. Now it is our turn to surprise Russia. The British officer explained how an alliance with Britain and France quickly turned the tide, destroying the Russian fleet and routing its ground forces. The southern Danube will be an active war zone for the next few months. Best turn around now rather than become a casualty of war. A few minutes later, the boarding party left and the British fleet pressed forward to Varna. Jamie Anderson climbed down from atop the roof and joined the others. When he appeared, all conversations ended. "Explain to me again your theory about Vendita having ties to Russia," Anderson said to Lachlan Morrison. Lachlan Morrison remained pale and weak following his attack. "It's certainly not an alliance with the Tsar, if that's what you're thinking. Vendita despises monarchies. Just like with the French Revolution, there is a revolutionary element within Russia seeking to overthrow the Tsar. I doubt the Tsar even knows the true danger of the threat, but Mr. Delhut is now far behind Russian lines where we can't reach him. I can't let Stewart arrive at the rendezvous all by himself." "Penny, get the maps," Anderson ordered. Before the two vessels departed Cyprus, Morrison had given them enough details for them to make a plan. Stewart sailed up the Adriatic to bring the women to a safe location in Vienna, which would allow them to come down the Danube. From the Danube, they'd reunite at the natural lake where the Danube River narrowed, still a distance from the Eos stronghold. A moment later, they all leaned forward to assess the situation. "So you don't know where they've taken Mr. Delhut," Anderson assessed, "but you have an idea where he'd be leading them once he's tortured." Lachlan Morrison looked fearful. His loyalty to Delhut was as strong as what Anderson felt for Stewart. "Maybe it's all a coincidence, but if the agents of Vendita used Russian aggression to their advantage, it couldn't have come at a better time," Morrison admitted. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, Eos needed a new stronghold, and the Carpathian Mountains were chosen due to their remote nature. As has been the case for centuries, Russia swept through Moldavia and Wallachia, but they went around the region supported by the Order of Eos. Transylvania, Father McPherson said, referencing the map. How tough is this Del Hut fella? Frank Penny asked. Morrison didn't answer, and Anderson lifted his hands in incredulity at the Texan's question. No one is tough under torture, you fool. So Penny commented, We're in a race, it seems. The kidnapper only leads us by a week or so. It'll take him time to get him to their secret lair, and then torture Del Hut, and then muster a force to go into Transylvania. Each day that Del Hut endures his torture gives us a day to catch up. And, we're still in a race to the rendezvous. Lord Stewart will be coming down the Danube unfettered by war, Anderson said, pointing to the upper Danube in Vienna. If we make port at Varna, we could travel by horse, behind the current front lines, and potentially get ahead of the kidnapper. Lachlan Morrison nodded. It's better than risking the lower Danube. But by horse, it'll take us 2 more weeks. Lord Stewart will likely get there before us, Father McPherson added. What will he find waiting for him at the rendezvous location? Morrison put his finger on the Danube River. There's only one way to enter our stronghold, and a fortress guards the passage. The Iron Gates, Anderson clarified, seeing the small identification along the Danube River. If the Roman Empire could not conquer it, what makes you think Lord Stewart will be able to get past? Get me to the Iron Gates, gentlemen, and I'll do the rest. What an arrogant bastard, Anderson decided. But Morrison's confidence gave him confidence that at least the Russians wouldn't get there first. So it'll be a race across Bulgaria, Anderson agreed, and then began explaining the details of the new route. Chapter 51. Zamora Castle, Wallachia, 1854. Bound in shackles, Solomon Del Hut had his blindfold removed by Peter Petrov once the carriage came to a halt. Welcome to Zamora Castle, Petrov announced after keeping Del Hut blind and ignorant for the past few weeks of travel. Mountains filled the carriage window. Since his abduction, he'd tried to keep track of how many miles they'd traveled. Much of that time had been spent locked away below deck, but during transfers, Solomon tried to piece it all together. He knew they'd traveled north from Antioch by ship, and then by river, and finally by carriage. Have they found the Eos stronghold? Solomon wondered, but had never been there in person, so he asked, Where in the world is Zamora Castle? Petrov's eyes narrowed. He could tell the young man felt comfortable, finally. Those are the Carpathian Mountains. We're on the eastern edge of old Transylvania. Solomon despaired, knowing that Eos' stronghold had been built in the wild mountains deep within the Carpathians. Yet Zamora Castle did not inspire any fear at all. If anything, it had a pleasant, welcoming air about it. Tall poplar trees, meticulously groomed, encircled the large parking lot, where almost a dozen other carriages were already parked. On the air, the scent of supper drifted out of the large doorways of the castle, with clean, new brickwork. Most of the modern castle was 2 stories high, and aside from being built atop a hill with an ornamental wall, it didn't offer much defense. It did have a 3-story watchtower, which had a squad of local Romanian guards manning it, but the castle reeked of wealth instead of power. We're not expected, so be on your best behavior until I can properly explain the situation. Petrov leaned in to whisper into Del Hut's ear. This will be where I die, Solomon decided, and knew if the opportunity presented itself, he'd take his life to avoid spilling any secrets he might hold, or to be used in bargaining. If there'd been a chance to flee, it would have happened back in Antioch. No sooner did the small boat reach shore than 3 other hired assassins joined Petrov, and in an hour they were gone. By the time they reached the sea, Petrov had a platoon of help. When they reached another port at Bulgaria, Petrov became the commanding officer of almost 24 men, although none of them were official military or of any distinguished country. On horses, these rugged men surrounded the carriage, some still tense and ready, and others dismounting to make introductions to the curious staff of the castle who appeared to greet them. Petrov left Solomon in the company of his killers while he walked up to those from the castle. After a few minutes of conversation, Petrov returned with a smug smile. The good news is that I've acquired a table for the feast tonight. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make proper introductions tonight. We're not the only unexpected guests. The dining hall, with its vaulted 2-story ceiling, held almost 50 Russian officers of various rank, with the lower-ranked officers near the door and the majors, colonels, and even 2 generals seated near the elevated stage area, where a long table faced the hall. Petrov walked Solomon along the outer edge of the hall to a new table placed a few feet in front of a side door. The rest of the room was already feasting and drinking, and the servants placed 4 settings on it just as the pair reached it. With Russia at war with the Ottoman Empire and its English allies, it made sense why the English-speaking prisoner remained in chains. The servants at Zamora Castle bathed him and gave him a change of clothing for the formal dinner. Since Solomon was still chained at the wrists, Petrov pulled the chair out so he could sit and then sat down beside him. Quite a sight, isn't it? What's happening here? Solomon asked of the huge dining hall and assembling guests. Since I last visited, quite a bit. Russia sent an army of over 200,000 to steal the Danubian provinces from Ottoman control, believing the region to be ripe for the taking, which it was. A few years ago, there was a revolution in Hungary that gave Russia a taste for the wealth of the region, and with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, they decided to seize the lower Danube a few months ago. It didn't go well. What they didn't anticipate is that the Western powers of France and England would back the Ottoman Empire. These jovial gentlemen dining here today are in full retreat after learning England and France have brought armies and navies into the Black Sea. English and French armies might allow me to find a way home, Delhut realized as he found a bit of hope in the despair. Delhut flinched when an unexpected figure appeared looming over his shoulders. My apologies, dear, the young woman said, placing a hand on his shoulder and pecking him on the cheek. She then leaned over to kiss Petrov on the lips in the familiar way of former lovers. I'm so happy you finally returned, she said. Lady Zinaida, Petrov said as if he didn't expect her. You've returned as well. How could I be abroad when there is so much happening in the region? Who is your friend? Even though the young woman spoke in English, she had a Russian accent. Delhut looked over to Petrov, who shrugged. You're with friends now. Introduce yourself. Solomon knew he was in a pit of vipers, but remained cordial nevertheless. My name is Solomon Delhut. I'm a businessman from America. He then raised his cuffed hands and gave an apologetic shrug. He's also one of the Grand Masters of the Order of Eos, Petrov explained. The young woman gasped with thrilled understanding and then turned to Petrov with a respectful nod. You've done very well. This is going to save hundreds of thousands of lives. They mean to torture me for specifics about the stronghold, Delhut realized. My death saves them a military invasion. That's what went through my mind as I held a pistol to his head, Petrov said. Imagine if I'd killed him as ordered. Oh, this is quite fortuitous. Zinaida clasped her hands and turned. I'd like you to meet my companion, Kut Besant, from Tibet. Yes, we met about a year ago during my last visit. Ah, yes, he was instructing Lady Columbia, wasn't he? Zinaida said, and Besant nodded in confirmation. After my visit to Wallachia, I plan to return with him to Tibet. Petrov scoffed with incredulity. You've lived 1,000 lives in 2 decades. When I last saw you, you were marrying that Russian fella. He bored me. That marriage only lasted a few months before I met a delicious Hungarian opera singer who took me on a tour of the Mediterranean. Then I met, Mr. Delhite, you'd like this part. In Egypt, I met an American named Albert. He quickly bored me also, but not before he brought me to America to meet some of the indigenous shamans who spoke of something called the 7 Fires. Are you familiar with this prophecy, Mr. Delhut? Even on an empty stomach, Solomon felt as if he'd vomit. His forefathers had followed the 7 Fires migration of the Chippewa from Montreal to his current home in Detroit. It seemed his enemies knew as much about the lore as he did. He nodded as he tried to find words. I live in Detroit, which was once home to the Chippewa people. I believe their legends tell of such a prophecy. I was only able to meet with those who remained in Nova Scotia. It was a rather disappointing experience, to be honest. Unlike the Tibetans, who have practiced their religion unchanged for thousands of years, the poor shamans I met were like dogs beaten by the stick of Christianity. They certainly didn't know what to think of me. That's understandable, Delhut thought as he studied the eccentric young woman. Can we join you for dessert? Zenaida said to Petrov. When I heard you'd returned, I couldn't wait to see you. Do you know what's happening here tonight? Yes, I was briefed. I wanted our guest to witness it. Petrov continued to produce a dimpled smile, but his eyes glanced to the doorway behind them. The Russian elites had drivers and escorts, but Zamora Castle provided the rest of the security, along with the killers brought by Petrov. On the elevated stage, servants appeared and began to bring the desserts and fill the glasses with wine. Both Petrov and Zenaida turned their attention to the empty table. A servant brought the 2 generals from their smaller tables to the grand table on the stage. She's arrived, Zenaida said softly. Delhut could tell from the way the servants buzzed around that a guest of great importance was waiting in the wings. He looked around to see the reason for the sudden energy. Even the 2 Russian generals seemed excited by the buildup. A beautiful woman in a red silk gown appeared, and when the generals rose, the rest of the room, including Zenaida and Petrov, also rose. Petrov tugged on Solomon's chains to get him to also stand. The woman glided over to the grand table, took one of the wine glasses, and lifted it high. The room grew silent. There is a reason why all things are as they are, the red woman began. And I welcome you men into the house of my husband, Count Kazunis. Let us drink to his memory and to the blood alliances that bring us together today. To Count Kazunis. The toast was made, but Countess Kazunis did not sit. Years before I met my husband, I was witness to another alliance. My father, a nobleman from nearby Transylvania, knew the importance of alliances, and on behalf of Tsar Alexander, forged a political marriage with my mother, the Princess of Baku. Decades ago, this moment of alliance was forged to strengthen Russia. So let us drink another toast to my father's ambitions. The Russians appeared to be appreciative of their local hostess and her sentiments. Countess Kazunis did not sit. As a young girl of 7 or 8, I was visiting my mother's home in Baku, a strange land of fire worshippers. My mother's people were superstitious, still clinging to the old ways. That was the day I met a man that changed my life forever. He was a tall, handsome, modern man of science who understood that Baku was not special because of its fire worshippers, but because of its petroleum reserves, which could help make Russia a powerful nation if it gave up its superstitious and antiquated ways. Suddenly, Zenaida stood up from the table, raised her glass, and addressed the Countess with, "To my Lady Columbia." Delhut felt a cold chill run down his spine, and beside him, Peter Petrov gave a cold nod to him. The Countess lowered her head in humility and gave a slight shake of her head. "You must excuse the enthusiasm of my friend." Several men chuckled at the unexpected enthusiasm. The Countess continued, "This night is not about me. It is about honoring the past and honoring old alliances. My husband and father made alliances with Russia, and so, in your honor of need, these alliances have sheltered and fed your weary armies and have also given you access to this castle. Alliances must be carefully cultivated, since change does not happen all at once. In order to shape the future, careful pruning must be done, and that stranger that came to Baku years ago understood such things. Even though I was just a girl, I swore myself to him, for I knew his vision of the future was the only thing that could save humanity from itself. So I'd like to make a final toast. Another toast to honor old alliances. To Joel Robert Ponset." The crowd, not knowing the name, did not give the third toast the same enthusiasm, but finished the wine nevertheless. "I'm already dead, aren't I?" Delhut knew the name of the man killed by Nicolet's allies, and felt as if the guillotine had already dropped upon his neck. The Countess, however, glided right past her place at the table and out the side door. No sooner had she stepped out than a line of waiters holding dessert trays steamed through the doors. At each table they gathered. Peter Petrov cleared his throat, speaking in a soft voice to Zenaida. "Now you may make your toast." "To my Lady Columbia, a light in the darkness," Zenaida shouted with such fury that the soldiers recoiled in disgust. The silver domes were removed from the trays. Knives flashed. Blood sprayed. Chaos ensued. The wine was drugged. Delhut realized when none of the officers moved swiftly enough to avoid their fate. None on their table had partaken. The slaughter was comprehensive and without mercy. Extra guards appeared at the doorways, preventing anyone from escaping. The few men who did not drink the wine rose, only to be struck down by the riflemen from second-floor alcoves. Outside, cannons thundered. The retreating Russian army had fallen into a deadly trap. Petrov stood and pulled the chains so that he brought Delhut to his feet also. A wide-eyed Zenaida stood beside them, still holding her cup, a horrified grin on her face. Basant still sat motionless at the table. Petrov turned to one of the guards standing at the door. "She wants their hands taken to make her aneth garlands. See to it her wishes are fulfilled. We'll be traveling to the Raven's Nest immediately." Then Petrov turned to Delhut. "Countess Simona is very excited to get to know you, but first, one more trip before you can rest." Chapter 52. Golubach Fortress, 1854. The Danube River begins in a field near the German town of Downscheigen, and from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, it flows 1,500 miles through several countries at a rate that would take a leaf floating upon its surface less than 2 weeks to travel the distance. For commerce and conquest, the Danube had obvious strategic value. One of the most distinctive regions of the river is known as the Iron Gates. The river flows through a narrow gorge between the modern countries of Serbia and Romania. Upon entering the gorge, the river is flanked for 60 miles by mountainous walls. On the western entry to the gorge is Golubach Fortress. Beginning in the Roman era, the narrow entry point of the gorge developed from a settlement to a key defensive position. The 10-story fortress is built upon the steep southern side of the gorge and has repelled over 120 attacks through its tumultuous history. During the Middle Ages, when the mighty Ottoman and Kingdom of Hungary battled, it was even fortified with a strong chain that stretched to the opposite shore to a rock known as Babakaj. For William Drummond Stewart, the Galubach fortress had another special significance. It guarded the gateway to a sacred vault. From the Hat Tower, the tallest and oldest of the 10 independent towers within the complex, Stewart could see his private yacht and recently hired Austrian brute squad docked a few hundred yards from the complex. Carl Andreas Geyer slowly and steadily climbed the narrow path leading to the tower, where Stewart had been alone for the better part of 2 hours. While the fortress still had a looming presence on the still waters of the gathered Danube, an even larger hill loomed behind the rocky peninsula. An artillery team would make quick work of the old girl. For this reason, the Serbs only left a few token military units, who readily accepted donations from touring aristocrats. Looking north, Stewart could see Romania and the turbulent waters of the Iron Gorge. Somewhere along that northern shore is Morrison's Road. Prior to departing Cyprus, Morrison had given them the approximate location of the Eos stronghold, and then the men chose this location as a rendezvous. Apparently, I arrived first. I hope all is well with the others. Huffing and puffing filled the air, drawing Stewart's attention. Geyer was red-faced and sweating. "What are you doing climbing all the way up here?" I found something very interesting," Geyer said, and then had to catch his breath. "You'll like it. It's an old map." Geyer took a moment to catch his breath. "Whew, that is a climb. If you're going to be chasing after a toddler soon, you're going to need to be in better shape." Geyer rolled his eyes. "But imagine the stories I'll be able to tell in front of the fireplace." "So what have you brought me?" Stewart asked, turning to confirm they were alone. Geyer had something resembling a quiver strapped to his back. "The local historian and I had a nice conversation last night. I asked him to tell me about the history of Transylvania, and he shared some local lore. First, he connected the region to the Goths, and how not far from north of the Iron Gates, a great war was once fought between the Goths and the Huns. Even though the Goths faded into oblivion, and the region became part of the Hunnic Empire, he said there were pockets of Goth territory that never submitted. Of course, these rulers of these lands changed hands dozens more times, but this area of eastern Transylvania remained a stronghold for the descendant of these Goth kings." "Kings?" Geyer nodded his head. "Of course, they used the term voivod, which simply means commander. But that interested me. The fact is that there was originally, get this, 7 voivods in this remote Gothic region." Stewart chuckled at the symbolic detail. "Of course. Why should this surprise me? Oh, it gets better. These 7 voivod, they called their alliance the Order of the Dragon." "Bloody hell," Stewart muttered. "Who needs Morrison? This place is easier to find than I expected." "Oh, and that's exactly what these trespassing armies discovered. Curiously, these Gothic Transylvanians were funded by Western foreigners who helped finance the construction of their castles. But along with money, they also sent out their builders, a secret guild of masons." Stewart chuckled again, rubbing his gray beard. Let me guess. Sometime around the 1100s? Yes, the height of Templar power. All 7 castles were constructed during this time in the most remote, rugged territory imaginable. The land held little wealth, few people, and limited resources, yet unimaginable funds went into these locations. A perfect fit, Stewart decided. The fortresses were meant to guard, not to conquer and advance power. It's why nations swept around them. When I told my friend where we were from, he said, "That makes sense." "Why does it make sense?" Stewart recoiled. "He said that for hundreds of years, young Englishmen would come down the Danube to Golubac, claiming they were skilled ballista men sent to guard castles in Transylvania. They would camp here until the Transylvanian escorts came to take them back to their posts. For generation after generation, these young men would arrive, but were never seen departing for home." Geyer took out the map, unrolling it. On it, Stewart saw a medieval map on the Iron Gates Gorge, with the pool at Golubac on the western side and the Iron Gates at the eastern. 7 stars seemed to indicate the location of the 7 castles belonging to the Order of the Dragon, which now seemed obvious, as if the Carpathian Mountains were the spine of the great reptile. Stewart pointed onto the map. "This is where Morrison meant to take us? It seems too much like a trap." "I agree. Look here," Geyer said, putting his finger upon the northern shore of the Danube. It was a road that led into the heart of the Carpathian Mountains. "That must be it. That must be Morrison's road. And the Order of the Dragon is certainly controlled by Eos loyalists. How else would you explain the English ballista men?" "What are the Goths, if not Saxons? Old Saxons. Anglo-Saxons," Geyer said. "If I were Eos, and I had the bodies of 5 of the 7 kings of Armageddon, I would invest all my money into the greatest treasure vault money could buy." "Should we go take a peek at this mountain road?" Stewart offered. "Perhaps we'll intercept Delhut before he arrives." "Without Anderson and the others? They're sailing upstream at this minute. Unless Morrison betrayed them already, or they ran into trouble. I don't care about saving Solomon Delhut as much as I care about finding the cachet of kings. After all we've learned about Eos, I can't imagine a world where their prophecies come true." "Neither can I. Our Austrian mercenaries are bored out of their minds, too. We could buy horses and explore a little. This map indicates it's no more than 10 miles from here. With the chaos happening in the east with Russia, it might be our only opportunity to travel without drawing attention to ourselves. If we can find it without bringing Morrison, we could catch them ill-prepared. It might be our only chance to surprise them. It has the makings of another fireside tale, doesn't it?" "Oh, yes. Let's go see this dragon." Chapter 53. Baal Herculane, 1854. The shooting stopped. Even while asleep, Captain Stewart knew what it meant. An assault was coming, and dreams of an older trauma filled his mind. A pile of dead friends were stacked in the corner, men missing pieces of skull after catching bullets while firing through the stone windows of the farmhouse. A few men remained at the windows, firing at the French advancing from the south. Looking around the farmhouse, Stewart didn't even know most of them. The Battle of Waterloo had been such chaos that fear drove them to band together to make the stand. Beyond the farmhouse walls, Napoleon waited to devour the world. Stewart rushed down the stairs to the main floor, where more bloody men were stacked against the inner walls, dead or dying. Sergeant Louis Carnes was one of them, having lost so much blood that he could no longer stand. Luckily, his eyes followed Captain Stewart from the stairs. "Supplies coming in," a soldier shouted. "No, it's a trap." The 2 doors opened. The first was the north gate, which had been the place where the retreating English forces had supplied the valiant company who'd stayed at the stone farmhouse to hold off the entire French army. With a provisioned sniper in the well tower, any French soldier who dared scale and drop over the wall was shot dead before taking 3 steps. 100 dead Frenchmen revealed the horrible accuracy of the sniper. Only 4 men manned the big cattle gate built into the stone wall. When it opened, a solitary wagon of ammunition from the nearby Allied ridge was rushed through, but it was too late. The French had sent a squad on a suicide mission. At the same time the wall gate opened, the door of the farmhouse also opened, and Stewart saw the horror of the French plan. A monster with an axe came around the corner, bellowing and charging through the void. Behind him, his squad followed, overwhelming the gatekeepers and rushing for the farmhouse. The farmhouse door slammed shut, but a few seconds later, the axe head broke through the door. And again, and again. When the entire door seemed about to come off its frame, Stewart put his shoulder into the splintered pieces of the door. That was when Stewart had a full head of hair and a mustache that tapered in little horns. My God, I was so strong back then, Stewart reflected on the life-altering moment. But it wasn't nearly enough to hold back the French giant. The door suddenly exploded with fury, catching Stewart in the face, tossing him backwards and pinning him against the wall. He heard roaring and screaming. The door had broken his nose, blinding him with pain and blood for those first few seconds. When he wiped away the blood from his eyes, the giant stood in the center of the room, taking limbs with each swing of his axe. French pistolmen stood at his side, but half of the shots were fired into the dead men. Between the door and the wall, a bayonet rested, and Stewart's fingers wrapped around the handle. With his shoulder, he shoved the door closed, facing his foot against the bottom of the door. The slam of the swinging door caught the giant's attention, and when he turned, Stewart already had the sword in motion. Now, when he looked at the giant's face, all he could see was Antoine Clement, even though that had not been the case back in 1815. Is that why I took notice of him? Did Antoine remind me of the French giant? Back on the frontier, Stewart had almost gasped when he first witnessed the brutish hunter. Now his subconscious revealed the origin of his fixation on Clement. This time, in his familiar dream of that fateful day during the Battle of Waterloo, the giant, who now looked like Clement, muttered a final phrase before he died. Sacre bleu. The giant's head came off with relative ease, just as it had done years earlier. But when it hit the ground, it rolled over to reveal a different face, a bearded face. The stranger still had Clement's eyes. Yet his nightmare of Hougoumont began to crumble into nonsense. Yes, he still saw Jamie Anderson cowering with his regimental flag, last of the surviving Frenchmen who'd entered the farmhouse. But suddenly a second squad of figures appeared. A sinister man with a black hat adorned with raven wings held a pistol. A tall, wiry man with piercings, tattoos, and green hair stood beside the sinister man. A chubby teenage girl with white objects shoved into her ear canal stood with an open mouth and horrified eyes. With disgust in her eyes, she muttered to Captain Stewart, "You killed him. Now there is only one." Another figure approached, a young woman obviously indigenous, but having the mixed features of the Sioux and Chippewa. She stepped forward, kneeled down beside the beheaded corpse, and picked up the giant's head. As soon as she cradled it in her hands, it burst into flame, blinding Captain Stewart so that he had to look away. This isn't real, and it isn't memory. Wake up. When Lord Stewart opened his eyes, the bright light of the flaming skull had transformed into the moon. It's night. I'm an old man. I'm camping on the hill overlooking the village of Baal Herculean. Stewart's heavy breath caused Carl Andreas Geyer to roll over on his sleeping mat and fart loudly in the quiet night. Their brutes camped just a bit farther down the hill. Is this an omen that Clement is dead? What's happened on the other side of the world? Stewart realized he might not ever learn, nor would Antoine learn of what happened to him if they failed. An afternoon ride up the mountain pass had turned into a 50-mile tour of the Carpathian Mountains, which were smaller than the Rocky Mountains in America. The Carpathians were certainly beautiful, but in his imagination he'd turned the secret stronghold of Eos into a landscape where evil dripped from rotting trees. I'm almost disappointed by it. As Lord Stewart sat up, his reality quickly came back to him as memories of his nightmare faded away. From the shore of the Danube River, they followed a small stream that was marked on Geyer's map. A village named Raveneska drew them 5 miles up the path and a few more miles up the slopes of the Carpathians. Having been to the Goth city of Ravenna, coincidence could not be overlooked. Either Morrison had been lying, or they simply hadn't found the right location. Raveneska did not hold a secret Eos vault filled with dead kings, but the villagers had welcomed and fed them. Instead of returning to the rendezvous location, Stuart Geyer and his Austrian team of hired mercenaries decided that with such beautiful terrain and good weather to press forward to another castle on the map in the mountain of Bania, a city built in a large valley between high mountains. War, the villagers explained, had destroyed their Saxon castle centuries ago. At this point, Geyer speculated that the looping path was only 15 miles from another of the 7 castles that gave Transylvania its Germanic nickname. At Baal Herculean, it was only a short distance to the Iron Gates, where Jamie Anderson and the others would soon pass. Now, waiting for the day to arrive, Stuart reviewed what he knew and tried to form a plan. To pass time, he did push-ups and squats to wake his body. When he lost patience at waiting alone, Stuart kicked Geyer with the toe of his foot after another fart. Let's get going. The sun will be up soon, and I want to be returning by noon. I was dreaming of Emma, Geyer complained with his eyes still closed. I was thinking about the name of this village, Stuart began when Geyer groaned and slowly woke up. You're familiar with the legend of Hercules, the legendary demigod hero? I wonder if it could be a metaphor for one of our guys, a legendary hunter. Sounds like Nimrod, doesn't it? The fact that the locals had 6 statues in this remote corner of the world is a bit peculiar. You're reaching, Geyer said, rolling over. Hercules is just Hercules. After the Romans defeated Burebista and conquered Dacia, they pissed out a couple statues here to mark their territory. Are you going to suggest that Baal has a connection to the Canaanite god Baal? A connection to Anath and Ramses? Does it? No. The statues were interesting, though. Don't you think so? I think I'd like to get some more sleep. It's still night. Go back to sleep. Disappointing. After speaking with Lachlan Morrison, everything about Transylvania made sense. But since crossing the Danube, nothing about the rugged region gave indication it was the secret abode of darkness. For a moment, he returned to his nightmare about the giant Frenchman, wondering what it meant. And then he heard a howl, followed by another, closer. Geyer sat up with a gasp. You don't suppose that was a wolf? Yes, I think it was. A third howl brought the Austrian mercenaries to attention as well, and they began to load their weapons. Most of the howling came from the east, toward the rugged Carpathians. Then a few howls came from between the camp and the village below. Those bastards are surrounding us. One of the Austrians fed the fire. Another frantically loaded their weapons. And a third turned to Lord Stewart to say, "Climb the trees." "I'm an experienced hunter," Stewart insisted. "Then shoot from the trees. They're coming." Geyer studied his options, picking one with lower, thicker branches. Stewart found another, a younger tree with branches that would help him climb to safety. He rushed over to help Geyer into his perch when he saw the man struggling. "I don't think I told you about the legends surrounding this place," Geyer said, breathing heavily as he found a place to stand in the crook of the old tree. Stewart had to jump to reach his branch. Unlike Geyer, who wasted away on wine and cheese, Stewart was still robust for a 50-year-old man, able to do sit-ups and push-ups each morning. Once his fingers wrapped around a branch, his stomach muscles were able to pull his hips up until his feet wrapped around the tree branch also. And like a possum, he pulled himself up the tree. Geyer often chatted nervously when afraid. Herodotus claimed that the people in the region were werewolves, men who were capable of shape-shifting at night. You don't suppose the villagers turned into wolves? Stewart ignored Geyer. The mercenaries began lighting branches, throwing them into the perimeter to expand the amount of light in the darkness. Suddenly eyes appeared. Lichens, they were called, Geyer continued. It's said that Burebista went into battle with a giant white wolf at his side. The locals are said to worship Zalmoxis, a man made into a god who lives in a cave. He wears no clothing or armor, and it is said no weapon can hurt him. I'd rather face a naked man than those damn wolves, Stewart said. One of the mercenaries fired off a shot, and the sharp whine proved to be the wolves were not mythical beasts. But a moment after the wolf stopped whimpering, the pack doubled in volume. Hundreds of them. Climb quickly, he told the men below. Only one mercenary climbed a tree. The other mercenaries held their ground, but the wolves began to prod the perimeter. Staggered shots rang out, but emboldened by the size of the pack, the wolves risked a few to test their prey. Then the attack came. A throng of 20 wolves ran right through the center of the camp, ignoring the gunshots. They bull-rushed one of the mercenaries, dragging him into the darkness to screams. 3 men ran for the trees, but they no sooner turned their back on the wolves than they were grabbed by their dangling feet and pulled into the darkness. With the scent of blood in the air, the attack grew more frenzied, and soon the pack grew louder than the gunshots. One of the mercenaries managed to get into the tree, but the others were cut off, swarmed, and killed. Then the wolves tried to climb the trees. Geyer was vulnerable, for the split in the tree was only 10 feet high, and with a running start, the wolves could jump into the crook. Whimpering, Geyer climbed higher, but with his arms and legs wrapped around the tree, he left his former standing place open. A wolf jumped into it, taking a moment to find its footing. It turned to see Geyer's foot just above. It grabbed hold. Stewart's shot hit the beast in the flank, but its teeth did not let go, and as it fled the tree, it tried to jerk Geyer from the tree. For a moment, the wolf hung suspended, but Geyer's grip held strong, and the wolf shook his shoe to the ground below. This is not how I wanted to die. For the next 2 hours, the wolves feasted on the hired Austrian mercenaries. When dawn arrived, the forms of 200 wolves surrounded the camp, eyeing the tasty morsels that climbed into the trees. Their ears perked. The entire pack turned toward the valley below. The villagers must have heard the shooting. Half the wolf pack retreated. The other half rose and began a new hunt. Thunderous gunfire erupted, followed by the sound of galloping horses. Those wolves who'd rushed toward the horses ran for the deep mountains at full pace. In the dim light of dawn, Stewart saw the large shapes of mounted horses coming up the valley. Although outnumbered 4-1 by the wolves, the mounted cavalry had bayonets and pistols, decimating the wolves that remained. The riders flowed right around the camp. A second wave followed and slowed. An officer took assessment of their bloody camp and the 3 survivors in the tree. Then he began barking out orders in Russian. A Russian? Not exactly the rescue I'd prayed for. Chapter 54. Orsova, Romania. 8 miles south of Bale Herculean, Ross McPherson could hear a battle raging up the river valley. The constant pop of rifle fire sounded at the break of dawn, and by noon, cannon fire brought thunder to the clear sky. Behind him, the Danube River formed a large pool by the Cerna River at the place where the river bent back south and away from the Carpathian Mountain. We've arrived too late. Having found a pack of Austrian mercenaries waiting at the rendezvous point back at Galubach Fortress, Anderson took command of the small yacht, and they all ferried to the place where Stewart had headed. Upon landing at Orsova, Anderson and McPherson went to the locals to find out what was happening, while Penny guarded Morrison below deck. The locals at Orsova said a small Russian army was cutting through the same pass for a surprise attack in an effort to regain its lost territories in Wallachia and Moldavia. The battle, therefore, was between local militia and the Russians. There had been no word of another group transporting a man fitting the description of Delhut. So what has become of Lord Stewart? McPherson wondered as they returned to the small yacht. The answers remained up the road at Bale Herculane, where Stewart had last been seen. We need to be careful with what we tell Morrison, Anderson explained once they reached the dock. He can't know how weak we are right now. We need him to remain our guide. What do we say about Lord Stewart? I'm not sure yet, but I do know we can't hide the sound of battle echoing down from the mountains. So they turned to their prisoner for insight. Having recovered from his wounds, Lachlan Morrison had grown stronger by the day, which worried McPherson. Now Morrison returned to a land held by Eos for centuries. To remind himself of the spiritual battle, McPherson had taken to wearing his crucifix in black attire even though he was no longer a priest. Even though Morrison was personable, he remained a mortal and moral enemy. And for that reason, he remained chained since they knew not who had the battle who had won the battle up at Bale Herculane. To keep Morrison in the dark, they pretended to have a plan much grander than it was. Jamie Anderson began the bluff. Lord Stewart's organizing the Austrian mercenaries, and he's tasked me with supplying the journey. Can you give me a rough idea of how many days I'm going to have to feed 100 men on horses? Believing the bluff about the number of remaining mercenaries, Morrison scrunched his face in thought. Do you have a map? Well, I know our destination. I don't know the miles. Once it was produced, Morrison put a finger on the iron gates. So we're here, and the Carpathian Mountains are the dragon with 7 heads. From the Book of Revelation? McPherson recoiled, having never heard the title until now. Well, the Order of the Dragon is neither Catholic nor Christian, is it? There's a pass that circles the head of the dragon, with Ravenesca acting as the eyes for the body. About 10 miles up the eastern pass, there is a crossroads. Your 100 men will be watched by the Order of Eos, and when the danger is assessed, word will be passed up and down the spine of the dragon by men who've served Eos for most of their adult lives. If attack is warranted, there won't be much I can do to stop the carnage. I know this might sound like a trick, but a smaller force might stand a chance. It could easily be overlooked. Anderson's plan worked. Morrison believes we are much stronger than we are. Father McPherson nodded at Morrison's suggestion as if agreeing to it. And from this crossroads, Anderson said, putting a finger on Bale Herculane, how far to the stronghold? The stronghold? Morrison shook his head. We're not going to the heart of the dragon. We're working together to rescue Solomon Delhut from Vendita. I'm taking you to one of the 7 castles where we will meet Eos loyalists. We'll need more than 100 men to deal with the rising power of Vendita. McPherson vetted the idea with Anderson. Our primary goal was to rescue Solomon Delhut, but we don't know if he's dead or still a prisoner. If Vendita has learned the location of the stronghold, they could be taking it by force right now. So our secondary goal is to stop Vendita, isn't it? McPherson said aloud. Letting Morrison contact Eos could serve that end, Anderson admitted, and then turned to Morrison. How many men does Eos have in the area? Morrison shrugged. Who can say? I know that over the past few centuries there have been several attempts to take our castles, but the cost is too high for most governments. If Vendita has indeed turned Russia into a pawn, then this invasion could be an excuse to wipe out these Eos strongholds. If we can warn them, then we will both Then they will both help protect the treasures, and then we can rescue Solomon. But how will we find and rescue Lord Stewart? Macpherson turned to Anderson and rolled his eyes at the complexity of the problem. Anderson added, if Vendita has a private Russian army pushing into the area, perhaps the English forces we saw at Varna will be arriving soon. Do we wait? This seemed to panic Morrison. Ask your spiritual advisor. We need to protect the treasures, don't we? Heretical bastard, Macpherson thought, but agreed with a nod. We need to move swiftly. Vendita is a greater danger to humanity at this point than the Order of Eos. Morrison guffawed at his answer. You boys saved my life and helped me get here. I won't betray you when this is done. I might even let you see the treasures before I ship you home under threat of death if you ever leave that home again. If you're truly godly men, you'll trust your Lord to bring this prophecy to fulfillment. I guess we'll see whose God is better at making promises. Macpherson ignored the taunt. Morrison was indeed a snake who would bite them given the right opportunity. So like us, Eos hires mercenaries to guard over these 7 castles? Morrison nodded. It was decided generations ago that secrecy was paramount. Poor, desperate boys were sent in, given a palace, given a place, and then asked to defend it. Palace was right. It's a proven formula. What happens when they grow old? They are given flocks to shepherd. The old men watch the hills, valleys, pass, and mountains. So Eos never hires locals? Once they did. It was an abject failure. One of the local leaders, Vlad Dracul, ruled over one of the 7 strongholds. Dracul, the Order of the Dragon? Yes, unfortunately, our locally born hero got captured by an invading Hungarian army. They carried him and his family from Bran Castle to Castle Corvinus. Dracul broke, just like Solomon Delhut will break, and helped lead this Hungarian king into the Carpathian Mountains, where he fought against his former allies. The Order of the Dragon. These are all Eos men, Macpherson restated. Since the failure of Dracul, all 7 castles have been manned by private mercenaries who have no families or local connections. In Dracul's days, the castles were manned by mostly Saxons. Fortunately for us, the Hungarian Count Corvinus didn't care about our treasures. He only cared about strengthening his kingdom in advance of the Ottoman Empire's invasion. For 2 generations, the traitor Dracul and his son waged war on the remaining 6 Eos strongholds, as well as the invading Ottomans before his reign of terror ended. Luckily, the Ottomans killed his son Dracula in battle, and Eos gradually retook what was lost. Morrison paused, lifted his shackled hands, and took a drink from the glass sitting at the table. For the past 4 centuries, Eos no longer utilizes local help. Mystery and tall tales now protect us better than any military force. The locals suspect dark deeds. Their imaginations have turned the Eos strongholds into the haunts of monsters. So Delhut, like Dracul, will be tortured to turn against Eos? Macpherson rephrased. Morrison nodded. But unlike the Hungarians or Ottomans, I'd suspect that Vendita now has some sort of local boss in the area, most likely local born, who is using the Russian army to achieve what Dracul failed to achieve. Anderson's brow wrinkled. So when this Hungarian king Corvinus captured Dracul, why didn't he capture the treasure? That's the way of Eos. This is why it's important that I inform any of the Castellans. You build a great vault, fortify it, and then bury the treasure in some remote place that no one would suspect. The 7 castles are shields. When King Corvinus laid siege to Dracul's castle Bran, All he managed to do was kill some Saxons and gain a hostage. Meanwhile, our castellans unleashed their men and monsters into the mountains. Monsters? Eos grows packs of wolves, and whenever scouting parties stick their noses where they shouldn't, Eos unleashes them ahead of our hunters. Armies die by attrition and terror. It's a formula that's worked for centuries now. Well, that's all I needed to know. There's no way in heaven or hell I'm bringing Morrison any farther than Orsova, until I find out what happened to Stewart. The next day, Ross McPherson found himself approaching the remnants of a battlefield. The citizens of Baal Herculean were burying the dead, and took little notice when a dozen men, not 100, rode in from the south. Ask them what happened here, McPherson said to Stewart's mercenary officer. When he got his answer, he relayed it to McPherson. A Russian army came down the pass, hoping to reinforce Wallachia and Moldavia. A local army came sweeping in from behind to crush it. A local army? Does he mean Eos? Ask him what he means by local, McPherson instructed. This answer took much longer. It was an army of gypsies. Gypsies? Are you sure he used the word gypsies? McPherson asked. Local Romani slaves who were liberated and then joined her army. Whose army? He doesn't know her name. He knows she is a countess who fights for her people and hates the Russians. He called her the Lady of Light? Columbia. Vendita is already here. We might be too late. Before McPherson could explain his theory to the others, 2 riders emerged from town. One man McPherson didn't know, but he dressed in the fashion of their Austrian mercenaries. The other fellow he knew just from his figure. Karl Andreas Geyer. Where is Stewart? They took him, Geyer began as soon as they were close enough for them to hear him. After the Russians cleared out all those wolves, they withdrew back to the battle. It lasted all day before the shooting stopped. Stewart refused to let me leave my place of safety, and he went down the hill for a better look. That's when I saw them capture him and bring him back to the north. And now, Vendita has Lord Stewart, along with Solomon Delhut, McPherson decided, and realized he'd now likely need Morrison in the days to come. This is the end of Part 8.